Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you all for a really fascinating set of introductory comments. The title for the session was A Problem Without Borders. I think we have to wonder, is it also a problem without end? We had a number of allusions to ideas that could make a positive difference. We talked briefly about agricultural use of antibiotics. We talked about the overuse and misuse of existing antimicrobials. We talked about strategies for novel interventions which are different from the conventional antimicrobial. My basic question to you is, what do you think is the avenue that we can pursue that will actually make this a problem of history and not of the future? Is there a strategy that could work? Or are all of these just stopgaps against an inevitable evolutionary force where bacteria are going to do what they need to do regardless to survive, to use us as well as everything else for their nutrient needs, and to be ultimately successful? So what's the mix of actions that's going to make the difference? Rima, let me start back with you.
Yeah, thank you, Harvey. It is a very complex problem, and I was going to say, I think all of the above. In that, I think definitely there are some things that we can and should do to slow the problem and protect existing drugs and prolong their effectiveness. And that's something that I alluded to in the Detect and Protect Against Antibiotic Resistance initiative that we have, where clearly we have examples of successes with CRE and MRSA. You get on top of antibiotic use, you do prevention, focused infection prevention, and you can make a difference. And so that's the immediate here. And as Brad said, we need new and better diagnostics so that physicians and healthcare providers can focus what they're treating to what they're dealing with. And then we need stewardship as well. There's no question. I mentioned 30 to 50% are prescribed for no indication or inappropriately. We have rates of antibiotic use across healthcare, across hospitals vary 3 times. So yes, there's an issue of physicians not knowing what they're treating, but there's also patients that get started on an antibiotics and then people forget that they're on. So stewardship program, and we have put out, and we're working with the American Health Hospital Association and others. And there are clearly some things, systematic things that can be done at all levels of the healthcare system that can help do that. And we need to better track and identify new resistance so we can control it better. And the things that my co-panelists were talking about, absolutely. The microbiome, I mean, is really changing our paradigm of thinking in terms of new approaches that we need to deal with bacteria. So I think all of the above. There's some things now, and there's some things a bit longer term. The challenge of clinical trials, Dennis Dixon is here, and NIH is thinking about it and thinking of broader clinical trial network. In our budget initiative, we talk about lab network, that will help us speed identifying these resistance associated with it. Would be a resistant bacteria bank, so that we can get these, characterize them better, and make them available for all of the research that's needed, to both in terms of drugs and in terms of diagnostics, and all of that while, again, research into newer ways of dealing with infection.
Thank you, Remo. Others want to comment? What mix of strategies do you think will make the difference in this? Stuart, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I think one has to think about the organism and the infection at the same time. Brad was talking about antibiotics being unusual. I've always called them societal drugs because one person's use affects the rest of the society. And I think that one can now add to that the microbiome similarly. if we're going to talk about doing something, maybe we should be thinking about how the microbiome could work for us, in which case we come back to what we all have learned in medical school and elsewhere, that bacteria don't live in a vacuum and they aren't by themselves in any of the infections or any of the physiologies. So we have to think of them as partners in a world which is microbial. And we have to realize that this is a microbial world that we are currently in. And I think that refreshing new looks at approaches is what is needed. But in the meantime, there's like a immediate and then there's the prolonged. It'd be great if we could develop novel approaches to infectious diseases, one of which we are actually practicing, which is to prevent the infection in the first place. You know there's going to be an infection. So you treat with a non-antibiotic which prevents the organism from pulling its machinery around to survive. It just never gets to make an infection. So I think what I'm trying to do is put it together as a plurality where you've got people involved, you've got bacteria involved, you've got governments involved, and each of them have a different role to play, but it's not one role. And I think that what we've been talking about here is if we use killing of the bacterium as the end all, then we're going to continue to propagate what we're in now, right?
Let me pick up on that because actually, Peg, both you and Brad talked about different elements of a strategy of coping with the offending microbe. Peg, you alluded to effectively a highly targeted strategy in which you did have lethal intent, but it was a very focused intent around the offending organism. And Brad, you talked more about strategies which might avert the need to kill any of the organisms, something more akin to what Stuart was just alluding to. I wonder if you could comment on those strategies, particularly as in light of this larger question of what all do we need to do? How important could those strategies be to break through the problem?
Sure, sure. Well, I confess that my ideas really come from the microbes themselves. All I've done is spent the last 30 years going out into nature and looking at the interactions between these microbes and asking them, how often do you use a broad spectrum antibiotic? Well, gee, not very often. Not many species of bacteria produce them. How often do you use phage? How often do you communicate with small molecules or with bacteriocins? And so they have worked out a system that survives the ages. The bacteriocins, even when they're used, are still productive. Somehow they manage to use them in a way that retains their efficacy. Now, it turns out they play a game of rock, paper, scissors, and I can't get into that. I'm happy over a glass of wine or something to tell you that.
We'll follow closely.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
But that's what allows them to recycle these drugs, and it's something we could learn from. But I think if I could also just add one comment related to Stuart's plurality approach, the one thing we cannot forget is the youngsters that we're teaching and training, because that's where the new ideas are going to come. We run innovation competitions at UMass Amherst, where I am, and the things these kids come up with are unbelievable. We never would have thought of them, and yet they work. So I just want us to continue funding research for undergraduates and graduate students, particularly for undergraduates, before they've actually, swallowed the pill and become research scientists.
Metaphorically speaking.
Yes. That's where the power of the human brain is at its freshest and brightest, and we've got to support that.
Yes,
yeah, I like to go back to first principles before I tackle complex problems. So this whole thing about winning the war against microbes, no.
Yeah.
We're not going to win a war against organisms that outnumber us by a factor of 10 to the 22, outweigh us by 100 million-fold, replicate 500,000 times faster than we do, and have been doing this for 10,000 times longer than our species has existed. So what we need to do is flip it around. We're not at war with them.
Right.
What we need to do is, in the immortal words of Dave Gilbert, achieve peaceful coexistence. The question is, what strategies do we deploy to achieve peaceful coexistence? I think that we need to start thinking of infections, by and large, in most cases, as accidents. There is no advantage in most cases for bacteria to infect us. They are much better off being non-infectious commensals in our gut. So in some cases, we do have to have treatments that remove them from where they're not needed. That may be antibiotics, it may be phages, it may be single pathogen therapies, it may be immune enhancers. It's all of the above. There isn't going to be a single strategy. We need to relieve the pressure on any one strategy so that they can't immediately adapt to that strategy. And I really do think that in the future we will be increasingly treating infections by a combination of targeted therapies targeted to the bug and therapies targeted to the host. It is the host inflammatory response that does cause the majority of signs and symptoms of infections that patients experience.
It's very interesting turnabout in thinking about the microbial world in which we coexist as the natural arrangement, and our job, in a sense, is to figure out how do we coexist peacefully, as you put it. It does invert the usual way we think about, in, if you will, the war metaphors of invasion, defense, and, if you will, destroying the enemy.
Absolutely.
So it does reverse things. Now, none of you has talked very much about agriculture and the use of antimicrobials in agriculture. Some of you have alluded to it.
Pathetic.
We could go on forever. But is it just so obviously a foolish thing for us to be doing? Or
Yes.
is it, yes.
Well, you see, it's now many more people see this as ridiculous and wonder how it happened. We have Europe, which eliminated it like that. We can't do that. We have to go through a justice and all that in order to get probably going to legislature before anything can happen. And so I think that these are the differences. But for me, who's been in this field for 30 years, and I should say outside, criticizing it, you might say Levy failed because it took 30 years, but I'll tell you, it probably could have taken longer if we didn't have this problem of no new antibiotics. I mean, that just sort of played into it.
Right.
You look around and you see where are antibiotics used. 80% are being given to animals. And then, you know, I was trying to answer this question of multi-drug resistance because it can come out of the single use and certainly low dose. But the important point is that the timing is now set, and we've got to take advantage. And we're wasting antibiotics, we're wasting we're killing our ecology, we're ruining microbiomes with all this. And you see a little bit of change coming. Yes, we're going to change. I don't know. I won't know whether we're changing. I'm talking about industry. But when you talk to mom and pop farms, which I have done, they only use antibiotics because they think that's what the industry wants. That's the norm. And if they don't do it, it's not going to be a product that's equal to the others. I think there's enough negative feelings about this practice, which is ridiculous. It's even more ridiculous if you want to know that at the time that this was discovered by Stokes and Jukes, it was accident. They thought they had found the vitamin of the world, and they were ready to manufacture. He expected a Nobel Prize, Jukes. He said in an interview that I think I'm ready for the Nobel Prize because I found a substitute for feeding people or animals, because you just have to give them a little bit of an antibiotic, which is not working as an antibiotic, it's working like something else. And nobody could ever show how it wasn't working as an antibiotic. But in any case, the point is that it had its followers, and they were so excited by it. Moved now 30 years plus, and what happened recently, reported in the New England Journal, where they're using antibiotics in malnutrition in children in developing countries, Malawi in this particular case. And while they didn't state it, it was the same sort of phenomenon that was being used with the animals. We're giving them antibiotics. We don't know how it works. We don't even know if giving them will cause the microbiome to become resistant, in which case it won't work anymore. I mean, there's so many questions, and yet WHO came out with an edict that said this looks like a good idea, all people should get it.
True story, Stu, I swear to God.
Excuse me?
When I saw that article in the New England Journal, the first thought that came into my head is, I need to send a box of Excedrin to Dr. Levy.
Well, I had more than Excedrin, but it's, thank you, Brad. I would have put it with the rest of the stuff I got, which wasn't Excedrin. But the thing is, the point of the matter is that intelligent people can do unintelligent things. Yeah. And I think that it's a blessing to me because I've spent so much time, and every step of the way there was a problem. Can you imagine, we did a farm study with 300 chickens in 2 lots. One was treated or not treated with low-dose tetracycline. The industry that supported this, through the Animal Health Institute, were shocked when we showed that the antibiotic had an effect on the people working on the farm, that they began to excrete resistant bacteria. How did that happen? Because animals are not sharing the world with us. They're in their own planet. That's what they thought. And it's looking back as I do some more of the teaching, that there was this naive belief, really, that there was one world for animals and one world for people. So looking back, it can take a long time, but it's fun. There's a lot of good stories, but I won't waste your time. They won't be at the cocktail bar, but anyway.
Well, they're important stories, but I did want to also, if I could come back to a question, Rima, that your comments made me wonder about. Are we, in our country today, doing enough in surveillance and keeping up to the knowledge of what is happening? And how important is it for us relative to a surveillance global network that will be able to detect problems emerging anywhere? Can you help us understand the state of play there?
Yeah, and with regard to surveillance, it varies. And are we doing as best as we can? No, we have limited ability to track certain resistance and certain pathogens. And there's certainly we have systems. We're trying to do better, but it's going to need resources to really get up on tracking resistance as we should across the board. We have systems, the National Healthcare Safety Network, that tracks resistance in healthcare, acute healthcare settings. We have something called the Emerging Infection Program that actually also track resistance in the community. And there's things that we can do to get a more complete picture, more in depth. I wanted to. Maybe we're done with the animal use.
You want to add a comment on this?
One quick comment.
Please.
Surveillance.
On surveillance. Then we'll come back to
Surveillance was a nasty word for a long time. I mean, Gates Foundation wouldn't fund anything on surveillance, and surveillance, WHO was very reluctant to get involved with. Now, all of a sudden, it's the word of the day. It's amazing. So you got to be careful what you're doing in terms of who you're talking to, because everybody wants surveillance, and WHO has this huge document, and yet I can remember clearly where I was told, remove surveillance. You can use survey, but you can't use surveillance. It's not the word to use. Nobody likes it because they don't think it's worth anything. Hello?
So just
Liked it, but that's another story.
Yeah, right. Go ahead.
Let me come back to Rima to let
just
the other
to
point
add,
you wanted to raise.
You don't want to call it surveillance, that's fine, but if we don't know what you have, you can't deal with a problem. And we talked about it here in the United States, but globally, there are definitely the capacity to find out what resistance they have and be able to track it is very, very weak. And one of the things in the global health security agenda, which is a partnership with other countries, is to basically improve capacity to detect and prevent and respond. And clearly, antibiotic resistance is a threat there. And so there's an objective to improve the ability to detect antibiotic resistance. It's fairly important because, my boss talks that we all breathe the same air and, drink the same water and eat the same food. And it's true. I mean, it's just, so that's important. animal use, can I say something about? Just wanted to highlight that FDA is taking steps now. Again, I think everybody might jump here on, but I can't let the opportunity go and not mention that our fellow agency is really taking important steps this year with voluntary label change of antibiotics for animals, limiting the use for antibiotics that are of use humans only for treating infections.
No.
I think that's a
Well, thank you very much, Rima. I want to turn in a minute to the audience, and so you might begin to think if you have questions or comments. We do have a couple of mics, but as I invite you, I would maybe, Brad, come back to you, because with Rima's mention of this idea of partnerships, you made some reference specifically to a new type of public-private partnership that you felt was essential in order to make faster progress. My question to you is, why will a partnership between public and private do better than just industry working on it as we have? What is it about this problem and the idea you have of this new partnership that makes it likely to succeed in a way that we can't otherwise?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say there's two categories of public-private partnerships, and they both solve different problems. The first category, which I'll come back to in a second, is industry takes the lead, for-profit industry takes the lead, and gets grants or contracts from government to help defray cost and risk. The second category is a 501c nonprofit. The nonprofit is easier to envision why it matters. It's not driven by profit motive. And if you're not driven by profit motive, a $50 million a year drug, a $10 million a year drug is perfectly viable, which would get flushed down the toilet the second it came up in a boardroom in a for-profit company. So the nonprofit allows you to select drugs that meet an unmet need irrespective of market size. That's the importance. Mm-hmm. For the for-profit, the example that GlaxoSmithKline or Academies provide is really important. In a large company, revenue, the R&D funding stream actually sets up a competitive relationship between each division in the company. Mm-hmm. So the anti-infective division at Glaxo is not competing with Pfizer and Novartis. They're competing with the oncology division and the arthritis division. Right. And what they have is a very limited amount of money that comes to them. How do they stretch those dollars? They go get government grants and contracts so they can develop more than one drug at a time and build a portfolio. And when you look at the net present value calculation, which is actually how most companies, not all, but most companies determine which drugs are going to be developed, you have to flip it on its head. It's not what you think. Revenue is the minority component of the NPV calculation. By far the biggest driver of NPV is time, because of the time cost of money, time discounting. If you can shave development time off and the development dollars are cut in half because half of them are paid for by government, the NPV calculation starts to look much more favorable. So in a private for-profit company, if they can tap into R&D dollars from government and decrease upfront costs and shave years off the timeline, that will have a profound effect on the ability of that division to develop new drugs.
Thank you so very much. The floor is open to your questions or comments. If you'd like, please approach one of the microphones, identify yourself, and address the question to any of the panelists.
Lance Price from George Washington University. It's great to hear this panel of some of my heroes. I have one question and one comment. As far as this new model for developing drugs, a private partnership, private-public partnership, don't we also need a new model for managing the drugs? Because it seems that the for-profit model of maximizing profit, maximizing sales within a quarter is directly in opposition to what we know about using antibiotics, which is to use as little as possible. Right. And so if you could comment on that, Dr. Spellberg, I'd appreciate it. That's
absolutely right. On the one hand, we actually are supposed to have management strategies in place. They just don't work very well, right? So we're supposed to have stewardship programs in place, but we need to make them much more effective, as we've discussed. And a big part of moving away from the entrepreneurial model is if you have lower upfront costs and the timeline for development is faster, and you're meeting an unmet need so you can charge a higher price, that's a completely different label that the FDA is going to give the drug. This is not gorillacillin that treats every infection. This is a new drug to treat abdominal infections caused by pan-resistant whatever. It's a much smaller number of people. You charge more money from it for each course so that the overall market size is still profitable for the company, but you have much less marketing going on. If it's a narrow label, there's less marketing, and that helps protect use in combination with much more empowered stewardship programs.
Great. And then just the comment now. We heard about the FDA's, the FDA's progress on this issue of antibiotic use in agriculture. But I would say that we should point out that this is a voluntary guidance that it's only addressing growth promotion, right? So we're not even talking about routine disease prevention, preventing diseases that are occurring because of the way we're raising animals, production diseases. And this comes back to surveillance. Without surveillance in place, without monitoring what drugs are being used, in what quantities, for which animals, for what purpose, through which methods, we have no way of monitoring to see whether these new guidances are successful, whether the industry just switches from growth promotion to routine disease prevention. And so I think what I fear is a picture of action, an image of action, when in fact we're not doing anything. And that breeds us to just kind of sit back and think that this is okay.
So I have a much less developed frontal lobe than any of the other panelists. And I'm just going to tell you point blank, there's no scientific debate here about what needs to happen. This is like debating whether global warming is occurring with ExxonMobil, okay? We all know what needs to happen. The issue is how we get the political will to have Congress pass the law. The FDA cannot do what we want them to do without law, right? Congress will not let them ban growth promotional antibiotics or antibiotics generally. We need Congress to move on this. That's really where we're at.
Thank you for both the question and comment. Next.
Hi, this question is mostly for Dr. Kabaz, but I'm happy for everyone to weigh in. We mostly talked about what the U.S. can do.
Can you identify yourself too?
Oh, I'm Tamara Litwin. I'm a graduate student at NHLBI. We talked about the U.S. regulatory environment mostly, or Western Europe, the EU, which is very developed. But in some developing countries, antibiotics are available over the counter. People can just go in and self-diagnose and take what they like for as long as they like or as short as they like. How do you think that we and those countries need to deal with that issue, with the misuse of antibiotics in humans in developing countries, and in particular, without overhauling the entire healthcare system of the world, which is a bit of a large task?
Rima, do you want to start, and then I'll turn to Stuart too.
Thank you for the question. It's a hugely important one that we have. I mean, as you point out, some countries antibiotics are obtained over the counter, and so there's so many different regulatory, different systems, different social, economic, and cultural approaches to medicine and treatment, which is that's what makes it a lot more complex, and so the solution has to be, there's no one size fits all. And when I alluded to the global action plan that WHO is developing, again, the idea is that there'd be some menus and different approaches in different parts of the world. There's also places where people cannot access antibiotic. So you have it sold over the counter, and then it's the needed antibiotic to treat their children around the world that die from respiratory bacterial and enteric infections because they can't access the right antibiotic. So how do you decrease the use, but yet at the same time make sure that antibiotics available for those who need it is complex.
Thank you. Stuart, do you want to add a word?
Well, yeah, I would just say that here is the problem of not having enough professional people in the country to begin with to monitor the drugs. Two, each country has its own way, and the best thing you can do is to try to steer them into a stewardship that agrees with, in large part, the rest of the world. And I think that's where at least Alliance for Prudent Use of Antibiotics is working, is the grassroots, to get each country to develop its own guidelines. But it can't be universal. And we learned that with 1981 when the alliance was established, was that you can't you want to avoid it looking like it's an American issue and that you are going to correct it. So I think it's best handled, and it is being handled, difficult as it is, at the country level.
Thank you very much. Next.
My name is Mead Over. I'm with the Center for Global Development. I'm an economist, so I was interested in the remarks of the last speaker.
I'm not sure the mic is...
Yeah, Dr. Feinberg, I want to congratulate you on a remarkable panel. I think all of us enjoyed all four of the speakers a great deal. One concept that was never mentioned by any of the speakers was that of fitness. And I've done most of my health economics on HIV, where I believe the impression is that the resistant strains are less fit and that there's a fitness cost. And I didn't hear that mentioned. Is this because you were talking about bacteria? I was wondering if you could make some comparative remarks about the danger of fitness in viruses and also in, for example, parasites like the malaria falciparum parasite. That was one of my questions, and I do have another question, which is a sort of a...
Do you want to ask the second as well, or should we take... Go ahead, why don't you raise them both?
The second question has to do with what proportion of the problem is American? So this is related to the climate question that was asked earlier. I think part of the inertia in the United States Congress with respect to dealing with the climate issue is that there's this perception that, yes, we're a large part of the problem, but really even a total change of American policy vis-a-vis climate would have almost no effect if we can't get the rest of the world to move with us. Is that also true with respect to the problem we're talking about here today, or is the United States so much of the resistance problem that we could have a really dramatic impact on the global resistance problem by just solving the problem here? If the FDA and the clamps down on animals, that's going to be a big part of that solution.
Both excellent. Peg, do you want to start us on the first question, and then we'll turn to the second?
So as an evolutionary biologist, fitness is my currency. That's how we think about how things work, right? The problem with antibiotic resistance is I can select for a resistant mutant that makes my E. coli cry. You know, it can't grow. It's like, oh my God, I'm struggling. However, I can go out into nature and find similar mutants that are perfectly happy in the environment, that are present in frequencies of 30 or 40% in a population. Mm-hmm. So the problem is that we tend not to think about what is it really that's affecting the fitness of that bacterial cell. We have no idea what these antibiotic resistance genes actually do for a living. We've named them something. We're actually quite arrogant in how we do this. We name them antibiotic resistance genes, but these things are 2 billion years old. These antibiotic resistance genes, let me say that again, like Carl Sagan, billions of years old. So clearly, if they evolved for antibiotics, they're in a whole new world right now. And they're not doing those jobs anymore, or they never did to begin with, which is my own personal prediction, that they have been co-opted because they did something that helped, pumping something out, and all of a sudden, oh, they were able to pump an antibiotic out. It's sweet. MRSA's happy in the hospital. So we have no way to predict the fitness. And Richard Lenski did a great experiment when he was a postdoc in Bruce Levin's lab, where they took this mutant that they had selected in E. coli that was not very fit, and they just let it grow in a chemostat. And after a couple generations, voila, it was more fit than its ancestor. So it's a tough one. No,
apparently not. A very excellent comment. Would anyone like to respond to the second question on what proportion of the problem is within the capacity of the United States acting on its own, if it had the will to act, to actually control?
Well, the one way that I can think of to address that problem is that there have been multiple studies that have shown, both within a single country across geography and transnationally, a very good correlation. It's not 100%, nothing in biology is, but a very good correlation between the local tonnage of antibiotics dumped into the environment and resistance rates. The ERSNet, the European EU-wide European database, is striking. When you compare across the EU, national antibiotic usage and national antibiotic resistance rates, it's amazing how they're correlated. Mm-hmm. So the majority of the problem we face in the United States is homegrown. You can just bet on that. That's not to say that we don't have imports, because we do. But we know that the less we use locally, the less resistance we will have.
Thank you very much. We have two more questioners, and we'll take both of those, and then we'll wrap up and ask for a final comment if anyone would like to make at that time. So the question is yours.
Hi, my name is Rafayat. I work on drug resistance at the Center for Global Development. Thanks for such a great panel. So all of you had mentioned the use and overuse of antibiotics and that leading to the problem of drug resistance. To me, it seems like it's a classic market failure problem where the true cost of using antibiotics in the society is not being reflected in the prices. So I was wondering if any of you on the panel could talk about raising the prices of antibiotics and if it's something you considered. My other question is to Dr. Spellberg. You had talked about implementing pay-for-performance schemes for antibiotic prescriptions. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that and how you're going to sort of differentiate across diseases and across doctors, because I, as a patient, may choose to go to a particular doctor because he's particularly good, and I have a particularly, invasive disease. So how does a pay-for-performance scheme that sort of incentivizes people who prescribe prescriptions for the lowest number of prescription different from pharmaceutical companies giving cash incentives out to doctors, which was what led to overprescription? So are we going to an era of underprescription, and how would pay for performance prevent that? Thank you.
So excellent questions. Brad,
yeah, the first question is, in fact, John Rex and I have published papers on, along with Priya Sharma from the London School of Economics, on antibiotic pricing. It's very clear that we price antibiotics ridiculously low relative to their value by any cost efficacy metric you want to use. And you could sort of go to the extreme and look at oncology pricing, where you get very little return on investment for many drugs and pay $50,000, $80,000 per course. We're unhappy if we pay $1,000 for a course of antibiotics. So if you look at our Nature Review Drug Discovery publication, we modeled a novel therapy to treat carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter as an example of a highly resistant gram-negative. And using standard Medicare performance metrics for cost efficacy, you could charge $30,000 per course and still remain well below the $50,000 cost per quality metric that Medicare often uses as a benchmark. So we're grossly undercharging for antibiotic use. Absolutely true. If you want to charge more, you need to do these limited approval mechanisms that we talked about, meet an unmet need and reduce death. If you're just another non-inferiority drug that's the same as everything else, you'll never be able to justify that kind of pricing. Now, to your second question, you are correct. I would say more generally, none of us should be naive that as we clamp down on inappropriate usage, there's not going to be casualties. I like to tell the example of, at an inner-city infectious disease conference several years ago now, a sister hospital presented a patient who was a 28-year-old who had a sore throat, fever, malaise, came to their urgent care clinic. They had put in strict protocols. That patient was given no antibiotics and was sent home on chicken soup. She came back 3 days later not feeling any better, and they reassured her again and gave her some Tylenol and sent her home. And the next week she was diagnosed with Lemierre's disease, which is a blood clot in her jugular vein. She showered emboli over her body, and she died at the age of 28 because she was not given antibiotics. And it would have been inappropriate to give her antibiotics. How often does that happen? We don't have great data. The best data would be, say, 1 in 10,000, which is way below the rate of harm that's caused by inappropriate use. But let's not pretend that those 1 in 10,000 events won't happen as we increase appropriate use. So the point of pay for performance is to give teeth to the stewardship programs and healthcare systems that Rima's talking about. So they take it seriously, and they actually enforce it and drive down inappropriate use. You're right, as a side effect, there will be very rare events where harm is caused. But on balance, risk-benefit, clearly more people will be helped by this than harmed by it.
Any additional comment, Rima?
Yeah, and I think that's why we need better diagnostics. And
Absolutely.
we need them available there so that you know what you have and treat for that.
Precisely.
Harvey, I would like that on the, better diagnostics would go a long way in helping us better use antibiotics.
Excellent. Dennis.
So I'd like
Please.
to first start by thanking Harvey and all the panelists. You're all extremely busy people to start with, and I know you've gotten a lot busier in the last 6 months or so, given the prominence this question has taken on because of the appreciation for the problem. Great segue talking about diagnostics, and it was also very gratifying to hear that the strategies you all individually mentioned are consistent with what the National Institutes of Health has just published on the web. And so if you're interested in reading that, and you may be, since you all came to hear this topic, I presume that's what you're all here for, not the fun part after that. But if you Google 2014 NIAID Antibacterial Resistance Program, you will see the overview of the opportunities we've outlined at the NIH. And we put forward 7 representative strategies. And they included such things as using the microbiome to target and attack the problem, using the hosts for immune modulation, be it vaccines, be it the innate immune system, or other things we don't even know about yet, or this concept of anti-virulent strategies, where you disarm but you don't harm. So you're not posing a direct selective pressure threat on the pathogen, you're trying to find a way to subdue the problem and then counter with antibacterial. So they're all there for your reading, and I think you'll see beautiful consistency that we hope to be targeting with national funding opportunities, international funding opportunities. And there we make the point that you have to put things in context. It's not just drugs, it's also diagnostics and it's prevention, such as in vaccines, that can be approached at our institute through basic translational and clinical research. And I'll stop there and thank you all once again for your efforts and taking the time to come here.
Well, thank you so very much, Dennis, for your comment. Let me just ask if any of the panelists has any final observation that you would like to register that we haven't had a chance to elicit from the questions and discussion. Anything anybody wants to add? I know this is not a reticent group, so I'm going to jump in and seize the moment to say that I know we'll all enjoy talking with them much more and completely during our reception. I want to just conclude by suggesting that we have come to grips today with a problem that is urgent, that's ubiquitous, that is long-term, and that has many dimensions that simultaneously need to be dealt with if we're going to have any hope of improving our situation, not necessarily even fully resolving the problem. We have, I would submit, near-term challenges around practice today. We have intermediate-term challenges around the adoption and implementation of sounder policies, and we have long-term opportunities with the right array of research that we can come up with the creative solutions that will help improve humanity's balance against and with the microbial world with which we live.
Harvey, I won't prolong it much, but I just think that the international, global feature of this problem should not be denied. And even your title, the title of it says that. And I think it's important to realize that we aren't alone and that there are countries throughout the world that are struggling with this, some worse than we. And I think one way we can help is to give them aid.
Thank you very much for all the observations, for all your participation, for your questions and comments. Thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking our panelists. Excellent. And now, please enjoy the reception. We'll look forward to further conversation informally.